Welcome to this training video, which supports the delivery of the Year 10 It's My Right unit as part of the OAT Citizenship and PSHE Education curriculum. This unit consists of a total of 6 lessons which introduce the concept of human rights and then focus on specific examples of the need to balance rights or where rights might be restricted. Although honour-based abuse and female genital mutilation are often covered within relationships and sex education units, these topics have been included within this citizenship unit to emphasise that such acts are human rights violations. OAT academies have been advised to identify the most appropriate age at which to deliver content about honour-based abuse and FGM based on their local contexts, as it would only be appropriate to cover such content in Year 10 if local incidences of both these issues were very low. For academies in an area where FGM has been identified to occur more frequently, it's important that this content is delivered earlier to ensure that pupils are sufficiently aware of the law and sources of support at the appropriate age. This is the Do Now activity for the first lesson of the unit, which asks pupils to identify what the person in the photograph may not have and things that others may take for granted. Pupils may immediately list items such as a house or bed or food or water. You should then encourage pupils to start thinking about how this person might be treated by other people. Are they supported, or is their voice heard? And then trying to make links to the idea of human rights by asking pupils if there's anything to which we as humans are automatically entitled. You might need to nudge them in the direction of thinking about intangible items rather than physical objects. When people start to discuss the concept of rights and entitlements, ask them to consider how or where these might be codified in a more formal way. There are information slides in the first lesson to help pupils to understand the 3 major rights declarations which affect them. This Venn diagram has been included in the slide deck so that you can help pupils to understand how these different declarations work. You could, for example, ask pupils where they would be positioned on this diagram. They would go into the centre as all 3 of these, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, the European Convention for Human Rights, and the United Nations Convention of Rights for the Child, all protect them. Now you can change the parameters slightly, asking where you yourself would be located. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights applies to all people, and as someone within a Council of Europe member state, you'd also be protected by the European Convention of Human Rights. A child in Iran would not be covered by the ECHR, but would be covered by the UDHR and the UNCRC. However, a teenager in America would only be covered by the UDHR, as the USA is the only country in the world which has not ratified or agreed to the UNCRC. Amnesty International has an excellent activity which can be used to get pupils to think about human rights in more detail. The A to Z of human rights activity is found in a resource called Our World, Our Rights, which is free to download from the Amnesty International website and is linked from the notes in the slide deck. Pupils are given an image for every letter of the alphabet, and they need to identify the words related to that image and the relevant human right. Most of the answers are reasonably obvious, though there are a few which aren't particularly clear. O for order isn't the most obvious one. In the past, I've described it as representing that people are being treated fairly and equally, and therefore there's a sense that all is well and life is like sunshine and rainbows. Letters X, Y, and Z are a little bit of a stretch, though pupils will probably be able to guess the link between an X-ray and health. The curtains in the image of Y are to reflect the idea of being able to stop people from seeing all that you do, which is how it relates to the idea of your privacy. And the Zs, in terms of ZZZ rest, are talking about rest in terms of sleep, although the picture doesn't really align with that idea because it makes it look more about rest being play. This lesson includes another excellent resource from Amnesty International in the form of this image, which is called Right Up Your Street. The idea is that pupils need to identify examples of where people are being afforded their rights. For example, this sign here shows that people have the right to vote in elections, and these people are free to act upon their faith. Pupils should also look for examples of where people are being denied their rights, such as the girl here who is being hit, and this boy who is being unfairly blamed for stealing while the actual culprit runs away. You can download a full teacher resource from the Amnesty International website to help in delivering this activity to its fullest, and you can also request free posters to be sent to your school to use in this lesson. The posters are A1 size, so they're quite large, but it actually makes it far easier for pupils to work together in groups to spot these examples of rights in the image. You might find it helpful for pupils to be given small post-it notes, which they can stick onto the posters, and then you can reuse the posters again in the future and just take off those post-it notes at the end of the lesson. Lesson 2 introduces the idea of needing to balance human rights against each other. Obviously, we're all entitled to all of the rights that are enshrined in the various agreements, but they often come into conflict with each other, so there needs to be some form of hierarchy to determine which rights are going to always be enforced. The Do Now activity for this lesson is to try to identify examples of issues which might relate to the 3 images shown. Pupils might guess that the issue is about people being jailed for something to do with elections. So following the 2019 general election, there were 595 cases of alleged electoral fraud that were investigated by police. Of those 595, 5 led to a conviction, and there were 2 other individuals who were given a police caution. The intended issue, however, is about prisoners' rights to vote in elections, which was the subject of various court cases throughout the 2000s and the 2010s. If you want to read in greater detail about the impact of conviction on voter eligibility, there's a research briefing from the House of Commons Library linked from the lesson plan in the scheme of learning. This idea of some people having their right to vote removed because of their actions could then be discussed. Do people think that that's an appropriate response or not? And if they do, how would they defend that view given that human rights are meant to be universal no matter what? The lesson includes an opportunity for pupils to read a news article and identify the conflicting rights. You could find recent or more local examples to use if you wish. After discussing the difference between absolute rights, limited rights, and qualified rights, pupils then explore the use of the mosquito device. In the 2000s, the mosquito ringtone was popular on phones because of the idea that teachers wouldn't hear the phone go off. And the high-pitched noise then started to be marketed as a deterrent to having groups of young people gathering in public spaces. If you want to, you could also play the mosquito device sound in the background and see if or how pupils react. This actually works best if you don't actively tell pupils about what you're doing, and as they've heard it and maybe got annoyed by it a little bit, when it comes to watching the video or reading the article that's linked in the slide deck, they'll suddenly have this realization of what the sound is. This task then encourages pupils to consider the issue from different viewpoints, whether that's individually or in pairs. You need to assign the 4 viewpoints to different pupils. They then need to think critically about what the person in that demographic might identify as being potential benefits and disadvantages of using the mosquito device. So, for example, a local parent might be happy that such a device moves young people on from parks or shopping areas, and therefore they feel safe as a result of that. However, other parents, or even the same parent, might be worried that walking past a mosquito device might lead to their sleeping infant waking up and crying, given the infant would theoretically be able to hear the noise. When pupils have written the arguments for their assigned role, you can have a town hall style meeting where different pupils stand up on behalf of different members of the community and share their views. At this point, other pupils should add these new ideas to their own worksheets to have a fuller view of the varied perspectives. At the end of the discussion, pupils should come to their own decision about whether or not the use of mosquito devices should be supported, and this is an activity which has been adapted from a task within the Amnesty International resource linked from the slide deck. That same resource has this comic strip, which serves as the stimulus for the Do Now activity for lesson 3. Pupils are asked to consider which of these points of view they most closely agree with and the reasons why. This conversation continues to explore the idea of rights coming into conflict and specifically introduces the idea of free speech and potential constraints. When discussing pupils' ideas, I found it helpful to have these 2 characters be assigned a name. In the past, I'd used the nicknames of Pigtails and Headband, which the pupils seemed to respond to, but you could choose whatever names you wanted to use. After defining the concept of freedom of expression, pupils participate in a continuum task where they move along an imaginary line to show whether they agree or disagree with the stimulus question. In running this task, you need to designate one side of the room as agree and the opposite side as disagree. Pupils then show the extent to which they agree or disagree by standing at a point across the room. For example, someone might mostly agree with the question, but have some reservations which we worry about. Therefore, they might want to stand a few steps away from the agree wall, showing that it's not an absolute agree. If you wanted to, you could make it a binary option and force students from one side or the other, though you would need to amend the wording of the questions on the handout as you're reading them out. When pupils have found the position that they're happy with, you can then ask some of them to explain their reasoning. This not only helps pupils to get a better understanding of others' views, but also encourages them to think independently and not follow the crowd for those future responses. Although there are 12 stimulus questions listed on the handout here, it's probably best to select 4 or 5 to maintain the pace of the lesson. The lesson then continues on to explore the legal limits of freedom of expression. And it's important that pupils understand that these limits don't physically constrain people from speaking or stop them from giving an opinion. What it actually means is that there might be legal consequences or punishments which come as a result of saying or sharing certain content. Pupils explore the 6 legal limits on the freedom of expression, and then in this activity, they need to identify which scenario best exemplifies each of these legal limits. Pupils should write their initial responses in the first blank column and be ready to share them as a class when the answers are discussed, and then any corrections or further comments can be added in the second blank column. To finish off this lesson, pupils are asked to assume the role of the Home Secretary and to make a decision about whether any of the characters in these situations should be banned from entering the UK on the basis of their comments or actions. Under the Immigration Act 1971, the Home Secretary has the power to prevent an individual entering the UK if their presence is deemed to be not conducive to public good. There's no clear right or wrong answers to this task because it's very much a subjective activity. Instead, it's designed to encourage pupils to consider their own viewpoints and to develop a justification to support that stance. Lesson 4 begins with an immersive activity to set the scene for the lesson. The idea is to have pupils believe that a new system is going to be introduced in the school which would have an impact on their privacy. The letter in the resource from the philosophy man outlines the installation of CCTV cameras, and the purported justification of using that footage is to improve behaviour and teaching practices. In delivering this information to lessons, you could feign having to delay the start of the lesson so that you can read out this very, very important letter. You could also copy the content onto the school letterhead if you want to add some authenticity, although if you're going to do that, it's probably a good idea to discuss it first with members of your senior leadership team, just to make sure that there's no confusion that this idea actually is going to be implemented if it gets out of the class. Pupils are probably going to be unhappy about the perceived unfairness of CCTVs, cameras being everywhere. The idea is to tease out these justifications, so specifically looking for comments about how it's going to be a violation of their right to privacy. At this point, you can then show this image. And this is an illustration of the actual panopticon concept, which was first conceived by Jeremy Bentham as a way of reducing the number of staff who would be required in a prison. So although one warden can't possibly watch all the prisoners at once, Bentham's argument was that the prisoners would probably be more likely to exhibit positive behaviour if they thought they were being watched from the central tower. So because they don't know whether they're being watched or not, they're going to comply and do the right thing. Connecting back to this fictitious scenario, the parallel here is that pupils would be more likely to behave and that teachers would be more likely to deliver better lessons if there was a chance that they were being watched. It is also really important to make clear that this was not really going to be implemented in the school, and it's very much hypothetical to set the scene for this lesson. The lesson then goes on to explore specific examples in which an individual's right to privacy might be removed. So, for example, naming an individual who's been found guilty of a crime in order to protect the safety of the public. This slide here shows examples of where privacy has been unfairly violated. The image on the left is GCHQ, which is the UK's Intelligence and Security Agency. GCHQ was taken to the European Court of Human Rights in 2013 for violating privacy by intercepting, processing, and storing data from private communications. GCHQ argues they were taking steps to manage national security. They're not interested in what people are ordering from Amazon or if someone's cheating on their partner, but that they need to sift through emails and messages in order to identify potential threats to society and security. The image on the right is the front page of the final edition of the News of the World newspaper, which closed in 2011 after revelations that reporters and editors had permitted and even encouraged phone hacking in order to access information which they then could publish. More recently, the Sun newspaper, which is owned by the News Group newspaper, as was News of the World, apologised to Prince Harry for the serious intrusion into his private life after they admitted using private investigators and phone hacking in order to access personal information between 1996 and 2011. Pupils then complete an activity which explores the potential risks and benefits of allowing police to use facial recognition software. After watching a news report, pupils need to list examples of arguments in support of the technology and arguments opposing its use. When pupils have had time to come up with their ideas, they can share them as a class, and then pupils can borrow or magpie ideas from other pupils and write them on their worksheet using a pen of a different colour. Pupils should then evaluate the evidence and come to a personal decision as to whether or not police should be permitted to use the facial recognition technology and explain their reasons. The final part of this lesson involves pupils exploring the work of data protection officers using a job profile handout as one of the world of work profiles. Lesson 5 starts with another visual prompt, this time asking pupils to identify the featured news story represented by these 3 images. Pupils may recognise Gary Lineker in the central picture. In March 2023, he sent a tweet which compared the then government's policy on people coming from France on small boats to policies from 1930s Germany. He was suspended from Match of the Day as a result of breaking BBC impartiality rules, and it's since been announced that he's going to stop presenting football on the BBC after the next World Cup. Pupils then complete a baseline task to gauge their prior knowledge relating to the concept of migration, with the view that they can add further information at the end of the lesson after learning about the rights of asylum seekers. This image reflects data about the people who entered and left the UK during 2023, and it's shown following conversations about the reasons why people may enter the country. There's a link in the slide notes to the gov.uk website which gives further detail about each of the indicated groups. There is a section of this image which shows figures relating to asylum seekers, and it's been covered up for this slide. After the concept of asylum seekers has been explored later in the lesson, this image is shown again with that data visible. Before discussing the concept of asylum, however, pupils are asked to classify these examples as push or pull factors. These are the reasons that nudge people to move somewhere else, or which are attractive in luring that movement. Pupils may have learnt about push and pull factors in geography, in which case this task may not be required. This activity from Amnesty International helps pupils to better understand the experiences of someone who is forced to flee from their home. After you read out the scenario, pupils need to decide which family members should stay and which should go, and create a list of the items which those family members should take with them. When pupils have made their decisions, they need to then adjust the parameters and narrow down the number of items to take to 5. You could say that you only have a bag of a certain size, and that therefore everything has to fit within it. Pupils share those revised ideas and discuss them as a class, debating the merits of those suggestions. You could, for example, talk about the benefits and disadvantages of carrying photo identification. Although it proves who you are, it also becomes a risk if you're then caught by the group of people who are targeting the family. A weapon could be really useful to use for protection, but equally it may suggest to some people that you are not wholly innocent. The letter itself could be used as proof of persecution, although pupils may not immediately consider that it's important enough to take with them. The latter part of the lesson explores the Rwanda scheme policy of the previous Conservative government and the number of asylum applications in the UK compared to other European countries. Pupils are then asked to consider the potential effects and consequences of 3 potential government policies. Firstly, sending all applicants home immediately. Second, to allow applicants to live in the UK whilst their applications are processed. And finally, to implement the Rwanda scheme and send applications overseas to be processed. Pupils should focus on the financial, legal, moral, and social consequences of each of these actions. For example, from a legal view, sending applicants home immediately would be a violation of international laws, and subsequently it would have a negative impact on the UK's global reputation. From a moral standpoint, it would mean putting potentially vulnerable individuals at risk in their homelands. And then it could be argued as a result of that, that the UK government would therefore be responsible for any injuries or other negative outcomes. From a financial perspective, it might save the government money by not having to pay for housing for applicants, but that might also then be offset by the cost of flights and other costs for repatriation. The final lesson of this unit focuses on honour-based abuse and starts with pupils creating a list of crimes related to a person's body. You could ask each pupil to share a suggestion as you take the register, which encourages each of them to be involved early on in the lesson. When discussing honour-based abuse, it's important that language is carefully chosen to prevent victim blaming. Rather than saying, what might this person have done to cause the abuse, the emphasis is on the claim that abuse is justified because of someone else's actions. The perpetrator of honour-based abuse is the one who's doing wrong, and therefore we need to be mindful of how we're framing these comments and the language that is being used. Female genital mutilation, or FGM, is cited as one of the examples of honour-based abuse. Pupils then have a baseline activity to measure what, if anything, they already know about this procedure. Pupils may not be able to write much at all, which is absolutely fine. This knowledge worksheet could then be used to summarise key information throughout the lesson, rather than using it to reflect on what pupils have learnt at the end of the lesson, as has been the case for other knowledge worksheets in the curriculum. When discussing the process of FGM, the World Health Organization's definition is explored before recapping relevant features of the female reproductive system. The image of the external features is the same one which featured in the Year 7 puberty lesson and helps pupils to recall the position of the labia and the clitoris. This image on the following slide shows the entirety of the clitoris, and clicking on the boxes reveals the labels of the different anatomical features in this diagram. The feature identified in that previous diagram, the one of the external female reproductive system, is actually just the glans or the clitoral head. The rest of the clitoris is actually quite large, although it's not externally visible. The urethra and the vaginal opening are included in this image to help pupils to recognize the size and the location of the clitoris. When discussing the features of the clitoris, pupils may draw comparisons to a male's penis and testicles. It's not surprising, given that the clitoris and the penis and testicles all develop from the genital tubercle around week 4 of gestation. Where the erectile tissue of the penis fills with blood and causes an erection during arousal, the same occurs in all areas of the clitoris other than the glans. This can then lead to pleasure, which is why damaging the clitoris is part of the process of FGM. You'll need to edit the information on this slide to make the data more contextual. You can download the Excel document from the NHS data website and select your county or local area from the box within that spreadsheet. It's important to note 2 things. Firstly, that the document needs to be downloaded in order to change your target location, because the function doesn't work if the file is hosted online. And secondly, that the data is rounded off to the nearest 5. There's a wealth of information on that spreadsheet, encompassing not only the frequency of FGM identification in your area, but the type of FGM which has been observed, the country where FGM took place, and the age at which FGM was undertaken. There's also a handout from End FGM, which you can use to help pupils to understand the different elements of FGM and the degrees to which the clitoris and labia may be damaged. Pupils are asked to make links with specific human rights to help them to recognise the connection between the content of this lesson and the wider unit. The articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are of particular relevance, as well as a number of articles from the UNCRC, as FGM tends to happen prior to puberty. This discussion is then followed by information about the law relating to FGM and laws related to other aspects of honour-based abuse. At the end of this lesson, there's an opportunity for pupils to anonymously ask questions or to make a comment. It's important that each pupil in the class writes something to ensure that any questions which are written are truly anonymous. If they don't want to ask a question, they could instead write down their favourite flavour of ice cream, or they could tell you a joke. Writing anonymous questions helps to take away a pupil's potential anxiety about asking a question to your face, but that's not to say that they don't want a personal response. It can be really helpful to ask them to indicate whether they want a response to the whole class, which maintains confidentiality about who wrote it, a one-to-one response, which would require the pupil to include their name, or whether it's just a comment for your information. After the lesson, have a read through each of the responses, filter the key questions and statements from other submissions, and then plan your responses, making sure that they're age and stage appropriate. You also need to make sure that there's time in the following lesson to share those answers. This is the final lesson of the unit, and therefore you may need to start to think about how you can factor this into the start of the next lesson before you then begin the next unit. There are a number of organisations who can provide wider knowledge to support in delivering the lessons in this unit. Amnesty International is a charity who campaigns for human rights to be recognised and respected. A number of lessons in this unit have made use of their resources, but there are far more that you can download or have sent to you for free in a physical format, and also loads of posters they are able to send you to. Amnesty International also runs an annual campaign called Right for Rights, which highlights 10 or 12 human rights abuses around the world and encourages pupils to write letters of support or to take action to encourage the relevant authorities to act more fairly. That website also features case studies of people who have been featured previously and been released from jail or been treated more fairly as a result of the action taken. The Equality and Human Rights Commission is Britain's independent equality and human rights regulator and has a great deal of information about the Human Rights Act and international human rights agreements. You can go on to dedicated pages for specific articles, which then highlight potential restrictions and case studies about relevant legal decisions. Karma Nirvana is a charity which is committed to ending honour-based abuse in the UK. Their website features a range of campaigns, publications, and reports, as well as an interactive map of honour-based abuse deaths across the UK. And finally, Liberty is an advocacy group which was created in 1934 to challenge unjust laws and protect civil liberties. Their website features detailed information about the articles within the Human Rights Act, opportunities to take action to defend human rights, and information and advice on a wide range of topics.